Greetings and welcome to Daniel chapter 11 verses 2 to 35. I had really intended to go to 45, but we had a lot of great discussions in class, and so we'll wrap it up the same place we did in class to keep us in sync. I've entitled the lesson, Wars, Conflicts, Battles, and Rebellions. You'll see why as this text plays out. Again, this is Daniel chapter 11, verses 2 through 35. Only one announcement just by way of reminder. Our next get-together at my house, June the 3rd. We haven't decided what we'll be eating just yet or what video we'll be watching. But again, we'll make those decisions. But please, if you're in the class, block off your calendar for June the 3rd. That's a Friday. Get together at my house at 6 p.m. So wars, conflicts, battles, rebellions. By way of reminder, we are still in Babylon. We're no longer under the Babylonian Empire, though. We're in the third year of the reign of Cyrus the Great. We'll see that in our text. And truthfully, Daniel is no longer within the city of Babylon. He's actually by the Tigris River. That's where the vision associated with chapters 10, 11, and 12 happens. But again, he is still residing in Babylon, and that's the key point. Just an artist's rendition of the city of Babylon. Again, an absolute fortress, seemingly impenetrable. That was until Cyrus the Great's army penetrated it, but that was because God gave the city over. You can see the northern palace, the southern palace, the Edamananki, the platform between heaven and earth, the processional way going through the Ishtar gate. This was the main gate into the city, but as you can see, not the only gate. This is the river Euphrates that goes through the city, as well as it's moated off around the city. The city was fortified with triple walls. Another artist rendition, this is the processional way. You can see they're reenacting going through the Ishtar gate. You can see the Edamananki with the temple to Marduk in the background. You can see the triple walls. This is the Ishtar gate in the Pergamon Museum. This is not a model or a replica or a reproduction. This is actual gate dug out of the sand, reconstructed there in the Pergamon Museum. This mosaic is out of Nebuchadnezzar's palace. This is part of the mural that lined the processional way. Again, this is not a replica or a reproduction or a model. This is actually dug out of the sand and reconstructed there in the Pergamon Museum. You can see the familiar line with wings. Daniel would have recognized that when he heard about it. This is the expanse of this Assyrian Empire at its heyday. This is massive expansion. Just to give you an idea, larger than the Babylonian Empire. Again, we are in the third year of the reign of Cyrus the Great, so around 536 BC if you're trying to nail this down in your head. Again, the Babylonian Empire has fallen to the Medo-Persian Empire. So wars, conflicts, battles, and rebellions. As we come to Daniel chapter 11, I want to remind you that it's really part of Daniel, a larger part, Daniel 10, 11, and 12. And so you really need to take them all together. And unfortunately, we can't teach them all together, but you need to keep them in context in your mind together. So the heavenly visitor came to Daniel in Daniel 10 to help Daniel understand the future for his people. We saw how starting in Daniel 10, Daniel got a peek behind the curtain. That was last week's lesson. If you didn't catch that, I would encourage you to watch it on YouTube. A lot of discussion about spiritual warfare, about really the reality that though we live and operate in the material world, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And so I would encourage you to check that out. But again, we are in the third year of the reign of Cyrus the Great. By now, the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem has not only been issued, that was the first year. That happened roughly 2 years ago where we are on our timeline. But that prophecy has been, Daniel's been watching that prophecy be fulfilled in real time. He's watched God's temporal judgment upon the nation of Israel lifted as the nation is being allowed to go back under the decree given by Cyrus. And we see that in Ezra 1. We see that in 2 Chronicles 36. And we read that many of those exiles returned and arrived in Jerusalem the summer of like 536 BC. And by autumn, they had cleared the temple area. They had resumed the daily sacrifices. And then by spring, they had completed the foundation of the temple. Now, according to Ezra 2, we know that there was just under 50,000 people that went back. Now, I'm guessing that's small, but I've been unable to find a reliable number of how many people in the three deportations actually went into Babylonian captivity. But again, I'm guessing that number is small, although I cannot be sure. Now, we don't know why, but Daniel did not go back. Maybe it was because of his age. He's in his mid-80s. But at any rate, Daniel did not return. But no doubt he helped those who were going back, and Daniel remained keenly interested in what they were doing, as well as their welfare. Now, unfortunately, due to the difficulty of the work and the massive resistance that the people there in Jerusalem faced, the work stopped. The temple rebuild stalled, and you can read about that in Ezra chapter 4, picking up in verse 1. And no doubt now Daniel has learned about that. He's learned that the work is stalled, and that explains why we find Daniel where we find Daniel. He's been fasting for 3 weeks from meats, from delicate foods, from wine. He's not been anointing his body. He's been mourning. He's been praying. So by the 3rd year of Cyrus, Daniel and indeed the entire nation are discouraged. The work has proven much tougher than they realized, and the resistance has also proven much stronger than they ever imagined. This resistance against God and his people has resulted in the temple rebuild being halted. And so that is the context where we find ourselves as we pick right back up where we were last week. And as for me, this is the angel speaking to Daniel, in the 1st year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. We talked about this last week, so I'll make no comments on it, other than to just say in passing, we see the spiritual implications as this angel is strengthening and confirming, helping Darius. And now I will show you the truth. And that's the key point. Now the angel's getting to, and I'm going to show you the truth. And then at this point, if you have your notes, which I'll send the notes page out with this lesson, because there's a lot in there that I'm not going to cover. I'm just going to refer to it. I'll pick back up right now within the notes. So chapter 11 is complex and loaded with historical details that were given hundreds of years before they happened. Much of what we're going to read, and in fact everything we're going to read today, since we knocked off not talking about verses 36 to 45, is fulfilled prophecy, both Persian and Greek. It's detailed at the level of absolutely mind-boggling. Equally, and yes, unless you are a person who studies history during this time frame, it is unlikely you would even make any of these connections. We're just simply too far removed, thousands of years from the actual events. But as we pull in scholarship, as we pull in history, we see that Daniel chapter 11 is more detailed than any other prophecy in the entire Bible. It's tough to work through, and it would be easy to turn a Sunday school lesson into a history lesson, which would not benefit you or I. So again, I will try to give you enough of the history to fascinate you, to cause you to marvel at the sovereignty of God, at his detailed knowledge of things. As the psalmist said, the one who's in the heavens is working all things together. He does as he pleases. So I'll give you enough that you can marvel, but not so much that it converts this Sunday school lesson into a history lesson. Keep in mind, this is still apocalyptic literature, so it's still apocalyptic in nature, so the language at times will seem archaic. But I think as you read it and as you refer to the notes or the things I'll say, you're going to see the details make sense. Now again, I'm not going to focus on every detail. You have 9 pages of notes that I've shared with the lesson via email. And so if you're inclined and you're really interested, please follow along with those more detailed notes as they plug in additional details where I'm just sort of giving you the broader overview. Now, in his sermon on Daniel 11, Alistair Begg playfully said this, quote, "I've actually adjusted my view. Where I said the end of Daniel 9 was the most daunting part of the book, that was before I made a stab at Daniel 11. I have now moved Daniel 11 into the first place as the most paralyzing challenge," close quote. Now, I thought you might appreciate that and quote him only to say that this is tough work. But because all Scripture is God-breathed, I believe this work is worthy of our time and effort. So with all that, let's get right back to where we ended last week, verse 2, picking up in 2b. "Behold, 3 more kings," now this is the angel speaking to Daniel, Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a fourth shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. So again, in verse 2, this is the heavenly spokesman. This is possibly Gabriel speaking to Daniel. And he said, hey, there's other kings coming. Now we know who the current king is. We've talked about it quite a bit. This indeed is Cyrus the Great. We know that he died in battle in 530 BC. We know he was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire. We know that the kings that follow him, the ones that the angel is talking about, the next one is Cambyses II. He was the son of Cyrus the Great. He ruled from 530 to 522 BC. The next king is Smerdis. Smerdis was also a son of Cyrus the Great. He was the younger brother of Cambyses II. He reigned for less than a year, and he died in 522 BC. The third king on the list was Darius I, or we also know him as Darius the Great. He took the throne in a coup. He reigned from 522 to 486 BC. And then this fourth king, almost every scholar agrees that this fourth king is Xerxes I, or we know him as Xerxes the Great, or we know him from the book of Esther as Ahasuerus. He was the son of Darius. He ruled from 586 BC to 465 when he was assassinated. He is notable in Western history for his failed invasion of Greece in 480 BC. It was the naval battle of Salamis. So if you Google the Battle of Salamis, you will see what Ahasuerus did that really helped galvanize the Grecian city-states into an empire that would ultimately, after Darius, lead to the Grecian Empire conquering the Medo-Persian Empire. And so history shows us the foolish things that he did that would ultimately, although he didn't know it at the time, lead to the downfall of the Medo-Persian Empire to the Grecian Empire. Now, at this point, there were lesser Persian kings after Xerxes, but they're passed over without mention, and the prophecy moves on to quickly name the next significant ruler. It's the warrior king who would rule a vast realm. We met him in Daniel 8. This is no doubt Alexander the Great. Now, before we unpack this, it is worth noting as you think about this, how God is using pagan kings and pagan kingdoms to accomplish his will. Think for a moment with me. I'll just give you a few examples just from right here where we are. Think about Cyrus. He's the one who issued the decree that the Jews were going to go back and rebuild after the 70 years of desolation. Think of Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. He is the one who was instrumental in preserving the Jews in Susa. Think of Artaxerxes in Ezra and Nehemiah. He gave that additional proclamation to rebuild and restore Jerusalem. Key points, the launching point of the 70 weeks of Daniel. Again, lesson 13 in our study. Now we'll stop here and just say this. We should be amazed at how, as the Bible tells us, the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord, and as rivers of water he turns it whithersoever he will. If this was true in 500 BC, I can promise you it's still true today. And then I would just say, last point, we're going to get back in context. God's absolute and perfect knowledge of what would happen before it happens is astounding. And it's not just because he looked through the portals of time, rather it's because our God is working to accomplish his will, never violating anyone's free will and agency. But as I told the Sunday school class, hey, Jesus feeding 4,000 with a boy's sack lunch is amazing. What's more amazing is God working to bring everything we're going to read about today, and yet he never took control of anybody. He never violated their free will. Rather, he set up in situations and circumstances knowing how they would respond to do exactly what he wanted done. That is amazing. That is a miracle. Verse 3. Then this mighty king shall arise, who will do as he pleases. Again, everyone agrees this is Alexander the Great, just a reflection of his march and his kingdom. Again, by the age of 32, conquered the known world. Probably the greatest king who ever lived. Keep in mind, he did not have the warfare technology we have today. What he did in a short period of time is absolutely amazing. And dead at 32, died in Babylon under mysterious conditions. Now, Daniel Akin in his commentary wrote this, and it's worthy of repeating. Quote, historians have written volumes about him, about Alexander the Great. God gave him one verse in one chapter. Close quote. Verse 4. So as soon as he had arisen, his kingdom would be broken. It would be divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom will be plucked up and go to others besides these. He died in 323. Again, this enormous empire that encompassed the known world. And as we've discussed in previous lessons, this did not pass to his descendants, but rather it passed to four of his generals. Now, it did pass with some strife, but ultimately it did pass. It passed to Cassander, who took Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus, who took Thrace and portions of Asia Minor, Ptolemy, who took Egypt, and at that time he also took Israel. We're going to see in today's text that kingdom will be known as the kingdom of the south, in other words, south of Jerusalem. And then Seleucus took Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Ultimately, we'll talk about that in a moment. Those would become known as the kingdom of the north in today's reading, north and actually east of Jerusalem. But again, what we see here is exactly what God said was going to happen here with Alexander the Great. And it's at this point the text shifts. So now the next phase from verse 5 to 20 covers the conflict of the kingdoms of the north. Again, we talked about who that was, and the kingdoms of the south. So it goes from about 323 BC to 175 BC. And the elements that God highlights here seem to be just this endless sequence of wars, conflicts, battles, and rebellions, thus the title. They never seem to come to a conclusion. In fact, I would argue that seems to be the angel's point. Man's constant struggle and constant rebellion, and it just keeps on going. A new king comes and there's more fighting. Another king rises and there's more chaos. Now, in our mind, we should juxtapose that with the kingdom of Christ, the peace and tranquility of the kingdom of the stone, the kingdom that grew into a mountain and covered the earth. One king, no chaos. But again, what we're looking at today is the chaos of these multiple kingdoms, and our focus will be in particular the chaos that involves the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to look at verses 5 through 8, and I think you're going to be amazed at the detail and the accuracy that you find within these verses. Again, we'll really dive into these, and then I'll kind of lighten up and walk briskly through the rest. But let's really dive into these. And so at this point, just so we're all straight, four of those kingdoms that followed Alexander the Great have really emerged as the powerful empires. And that's the kingdom of the Ptolemies to the south, based in Egypt, and the kingdom of the Seleucids to the north and the east, the king of the north, based in Syria and in Babylon. What I would ask you to do is, when I sent the email out, I attached the student sheets. If you would, either turn to your Bible so that you can follow along in your Bible, because I'm going to take these verses off and bring up a different display. Or if you like, follow along on those note sheet. But in any case, I need you to pause me if you need to for a second, get your Bible out or get the sheet out, because I'm going to take down the verses, and we're actually going to walk through a different display as I walk through the verses. Okay, so let's do that. So in this display, what you have is the kingdoms of the south. These are the Ptolemies out of Egypt. And the kingdoms of the north, these are out of Syria and Babylon. This is the Seleucid Empire. And so now we're going to walk through these first few verses. Then the king of the south shall be strong, But one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be great authority. Now here's what we know. Ptolemy I was a capable general under Alexander, and he became the ruler of Egypt. About the same time, Seleucid I started out as a lesser general under Alexander, and he was given Babylon to rule. But one of his other generals, Antigonus I, took over and caused Seleucus to flee. Now, where would Seleucus flee? You can almost guess. He fled back to Ptolemy I. He had been a general with Ptolemy under Alexander the Great, and he served Ptolemy as one of his generals. Thus, for a short time, he was one of Ptolemy's princes. Then Antigonus was defeated in Gaza in 312 BC, and Seleucid returned to Babylon to retake his former authority. Now, from this point forward, the Seleucid Empire increases significantly in power and takes over areas of Babylon, Syria, and Media, and became stronger, Seleucid I did, than Ptolemy I, fulfilling what verse 5 said. Verse 6, after some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughters of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. Now, around 250 BC, Ptolemy II, king of the south, attempted to make peace with Antiochus II, the king of the north, by sending his daughter. The his is Ptolemy II's daughter, Bernice, to Antiochus II, so that they could wed. Again, you can see the intrigue here. Ptolemy II is thinking he might have influence over the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus II is thinking he might have influence over the Ptolemaic Empire. Now, with Ptolemy II sending Bernice to Antiochus II, there was only one small problem. That small problem is that Antiochus II was already married to a woman named Laodicea. Now, if that name sounds familiar, the city of Laodicea was named after Laodicea. But ultimately, Antiochus II planned to divorce her, disinherit her son so that he could marry Bernice, have children with Bernice, and live happily ever after. Oh. Now, I hope you can catch the intrigue here. Ultimately, Laodicea has Antiochus II and Bernice poisoned, thus fulfilling the words that she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. In fact, they did not. Also in the same year, Bernice's father, the one who had sent Bernice in the first place, Ptolemy II, died in Egypt, fulfilling the fact that even the one that fathered her and supported her in those times would also be given up. Again, completely fulfilling what we read in verse 6. We now come to verse 7. And from a branch of her roots one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. So Bernice's father, Ptolemy II, dies in Egypt, and he was succeeded by? Sure, Bernice's brother, Ptolemy III, a branch of her own roots in verse 7. No doubt filled with rage over his father's just passed away, his sister has died in this crazy exchange with the Seleucids, he invades the Seleucid kingdom and conquers its capital, Antioch, exactly as verse 7 predicted. Again, you can see the sovereignty of God. You can see this angel providing Daniel all of these details. Verse 8, he shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And for some years, he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. So Ptolemy III captured the capital, looted it, seized many idols, other valuables, returned to Egypt with many treasures, and he refrains from other battles for many years. Now again, just in these few verses, we find shocking and amazing details. But now I'd like to take us back to the text. And so that's when he goes and conquers. As you look at verses 2 through 8, and we talked about the amazing detail here, I would ask you a question. Does anything about these verses sort of jump out at you? And probably if you're like me, you're like, nah, not really. I don't see anything that particularly jumps out at me. Well, let me do something and tell me if that helps. Does anything jump out at you now? Sure, right? It's the English translation of this verb, shall. These things shall happen. In fact, just in verses 2b through 8, so let's call it 7 verses, it's really 6.5 verses, this translation is used 20 times. I hope you get the idea that God is not saying this might happen, this could happen, this is likely to happen, this is a great possibility of happening. This shall happen. Now, if you're thinking, well, it probably dries up from here, actually, if you take verse 1 out and just look at the next 44 verses, it's used approximately 119 times. I say approximately because I counted them and I could have counted an extra one or missed one. But what I would say is, yikes! God is wanting us to understand that the sovereign of the universe doesn't deal with if this goes on, that might happen. He is laying out history, detailed history, that shall come to pass. This is our sovereign God. And so now what we'll do as we advance from here is, again, you keep your Bible open. I'm just going to start walking through the verses and telling you who they are. You can look at the little diagram or anything like that. So verse 9, then the latter, this will be Seleucus II, shall come into the realm of the kings of the south, apparently to regain lost land, but shall return to his own land. Verse 10, his sons, that will be Seleucus III and Antiochus II, shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. And by the way, I said that was Antiochus II. It's actually Seleucus III and Antiochus III. So forgive that misstatement. His two sons are both the thirds. Verse 11. Then the king of the south, this would be Ptolemy IV, moved with rage because of the advances of Antiochus III, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, and it shall be given into his hand. So Antiochus III suffers a severe defeat in Raphia in Palestine. Verse 12. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall be cast down tens of thousands, a severe defeat, but he shall not prevail. So he could not capitalize on the victory, and from this point in the chapter, the Ptolemies begin to weaken as the Seleucid kingdom becomes increasingly more and more dominant. Verse 13, for the king of the north shall again raise a multitude. Now this is after a period of about 15 years. Antiochus III invades Phoenicia and Syria with a great army. Going back to the verse, this army is greater than the first. And after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. And he did, verse 14. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south, Ptolemy V, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision. Let me pause there for a minute. So Jews joined in an attempt to overthrow the Ptolemaic Empire, the Egyptian rule, thinking that life under the Seleucid Empire would be better. Man, were they wrong. The end of verse 14, but they shall fail. The Jews tried to do this. It didn't yet happen. In fact, a southern general, Ptolemaic general named Scopas, put down the rebellion and punished many Jewish leaders. Verse 15, then the king of the north, this is still Antiochus III, shall come and throw up a siege work and take a well-fortified city. This city was Paneas. We know it in New Testament times as Caesarea Philippi. This was the furthest that Jesus traveled north, at least as far as we know, with his apostles. Back to the Bible verse, and the forces of the south, this is under General Scopas, shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. Ultimately, there is not General Scopas surrenders. The Ptolemaic general surrenders. But he who comes against him, this is still Antiochus III, shall do as he wills. And we see this of the kings many times. And none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. So Antiochus III gains control of Phoenicia and Palestine. And by the way, when he enters Jerusalem in 198 BC, he's welcomed as a benefactor and a deliverer of the Jewish people from the horrible Ptolemaic rule. Man, they had no idea what was coming. Verse 17. He shall set his face to come with strength, to come with the strength of his whole kingdom. And he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. So again, we find more court intrigue. In this case, Antiochus III gives his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V in marriage. Now he's hoping that his grandson would rule over Egypt, would rule a Ptolemaic empire, and he would have some influence. Cleopatra ultimately supports her husband Ptolemy V, and the plan does not stand as verse 17 told us it would not stand. Verse 18. Afterward he shall turn his face to the coastland, this is Antiochus III, and shall capture many of them. So Antiochus III turns his attention to Asia Minor and possibly even Greece. Back to verse 18. But a commander, by the way, it's a Roman commander, shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. And so here we find that Antiochus III is forced into a treaty in which he surrenders land, he surrenders military forces, and he agrees to begin to pay tribute. The Seleucid Empire under Antiochus III paying tribute to the Ptolemaic Empire. Verse 19. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortress of his own land. So now he's going to return to his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. Now he's killed in his own land. And I'm not going to get into it, but if this interests you, check the notes that I've included with the email, and you can read the details of what he was doing when Antiochus III is killed. Verse 20. Then shall arise in his place, this is Seleucus IV, one who shall send an exactor of tribute. This is Heliodorus, whose mission was to collect the annual tribute owed to Rome. Back to the verse. For the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days, this will be Seleucus IV, shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. In fact, it's amazing, Seleucus IV was actually poisoned by Heliodorus. Now, if this detailed history interests you, I would encourage you, get the notes that went out with the email, follow those along, pause me if you need to. I include a lot of shocking and interesting details. But again, I just wanted to quickly get us through this history because I don't want to get bogged down into turning this into a history lesson. This brings us to the third phase, the next phase of this history, and this is Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. We've talked about him already. So we saw the reign of Seleucid kings, but God now slows down to highlight for us one particular evil ruler, Antiochus IV. This is the same ruler that God highlighted in Daniel 8, 9 through 14. Now keep in mind, in your Bible, there's no underline, bolding, highlighting, circling. God's method to highlight something is to repeat it, include repetition, or to speak more about it. So in the first 20 verses, God covered a period of 365 years. In these next 15 verses, God is going to cover a period of 11 years, the period of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So God slows down once again to talk about this madman who rose out of the Grecian Empire, in particular out of the Seleucid Empire. He was a horrible tyrant. He was an antichrist. And as we looked at Daniel 8, I said he likely serves as a picture too of the final antichrist. But do not lose the point. This prophecy is first about him and the horrible things he does to the Jews. Now, I agree, that's probably not the ultimate eschatological event as you look at him, but don't worry, the text is, as most scholars believe, beginning in verse 36, going to transition to the actual Antichrist. So verse 21, in his place shall arise a contemptible person. This is Antiochus IV, to whom royal majesty has not been given. Now Seleucid IV's son, Demetrius I, was the rightful heir of the throne. He, this is Antiochus IV, shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. That's exactly what he did. He paid off important people to support him to gain control of the kingdom. Verse 22, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. So Ptolemy VI came against Antiochus IV, but was defeated and taken hostage. Later, Ptolemy VI, the prince of the covenant, and you'll see why he's called that, makes an alliance, a covenant with Antiochus IV. Now, why would he make a covenant? Well, he's saying, hey, if you and I go into league together, we can rule both kingdoms. He does this to regain the throne because his brother, Ptolemy VIII, has taken it while he was imprisoned in Syria. So his brother just stepped in, and now he's frustrated. He's telling Antiochus, hey, let's work together so that I can regain the throne. Verse 24, without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province. Antiochus IV retaliated and plundered some of the richest parts of the Egyptian territory. He shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoils, and goods. He shall devise plans against the strongholds, and he did. He devised grand plans to take Egypt, but it was only for a time. He couldn't do it. Verse 25, and he, this is Antiochus IV, shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceeding great and mighty army. It shall not stand, for the plots shall be devised against him. Ptolemy's counselors encourage him to go out to war against Antiochus IV, and he's defeated. And that's why I read in verse 26, even those who ate food at his own table would break him. His army would be swept away. Many would fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their hearts would be bent on doing evil. They would speak lies at the same table to no avail. And this is referring to Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI. Although they were making all these deals, they were making a covenant. Ultimately, they were both lying to each other. And ultimately, Ptolemy VI reunites with his brother Ptolemy VIII because these two had just been lying to each other the entire time. Verse 28. And he shall return, this Antiochus IV, to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. So here we begin getting hints of him dealing ruthlessly with the Druze. According to 2 Maccabees 5:12 through 14, he killed 80,000 men, women, and children, and plundered the temple. Verse 29, at the time appointed, and I would argue appointed by God, he, Antiochus IV, shall return. This is return to the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. So no victory this time. Verse 30, for the ships of Kittim, that's the Roman fleet, shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw and turn back. Now several historians tell us this story of the defeat of Antiochus IV, stating the Roman commander, I'll butcher his name, Gaius Pompilius Lanus, met Antiochus IV outside Alexandria and handed him a letter from the Roman Senate, telling him to leave Egypt at the risk of war with Rome. Antiochus IV responded something like, let me refer with my counselors and I will let you know our decision. Pompilius, who had a walking stick, a vine, drew a circle around Antiochus IV and told him to make the decision when he left the circle. Either he would march toward Egypt and he would face Rome, or he would go back home. Ultimately, enraged, he left the circle and headed back home. But we read in verse 30, he was enraged and took action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the covenant. So now, being humiliated and unable to advance any further with Egypt, he turns his anger to Palestine. And again, I would encourage you to read the detailed notes that I sent out. And he rewarded those Jews who supported him by adopting his Hellenistic policies. And ultimately, as the angel describes it, it was a rage against the Holy Covenant. It was against God's people. It was against God. Verse 31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So later in the same year, Antiochus comes back, this time to completely quelch, suppress, put down all Jewish religious practices in earnest. He's played around with trying to stop it. He's played around with trying to get the Jews to adopt Hellenistic policies, but many have not. He enters the temple. He profanes the temple. He stops the morning and evening daily offerings. We know the day. This was the 15th day of our calendar of Chislev, December. He set up an idol to Zeus, to Jupiter in the temple, and he sacrificed swine on the altar. Antiochus had his soldiers kill people who were in possession of Old Testament scrolls, put people to death who were circumcising their children. Now I'll just read you 2 verses out of 1 Maccabees. Again, history, but reasonably reliable history, we believe. 1 Maccabees 1:60 and 61. According to the decree, and that was the decree by Antiochus IV, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families, and those who circumcised them. And they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. They killed the women. They killed the families. They killed the people who were doing the circumcised. They killed the children, and then they hung the children around the neck of the mother. You haven't seen a butcher like Antiochus IV. An amazing picture of the Antichrist. Verse 32. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. So Antiochus IV's flattery entices some Jews to turn against the covenant, which is shocking. But some faithful Jews, we're told those who know their God, stood firm. They chose to die rather than violate God's laws, and indeed many of them did die. But it also was the launch of a revolt as many took action. This is referring to the high priest Matthias and his 5 sons ultimately leading the Maccabean revolt that ultimately resulted in the temple being cleansed and rededicated, and really Syrian rule being put down and at least pushed out. But never forget this point as you look at verse 32. There's universal truth here. The people who know their God will always stand firm and take action. And that's exactly what we see here. Verse 33, and the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by the sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined and purified. So again, we see God's answer, why, response to sin. But even during this time, God brings some back to faith, even though they died in the process. And many are made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. And again, I give you some additional notes there. I would encourage you to read them. And that now brings us to chapter 36, and one who is greater than Antiochus IV. And if you can think about greater and more evil than Antiochus IV, it's probably rather shocking and amazing to get there. But what we did in Sunday school class is we didn't have time for these verses, so we stopped right there and then just briefly shifted the focus to, okay, what are the lessons that I should learn out of this? What are the faith lessons? What are the takeaways for me? And so I'll just give you a few, no particular order. Number 1, the God who delivered Daniel and the nation of Israel in spite of their sin is the God whom you and I serve. He is the sovereign of the universe. He is the one who's working all things together for our good in His glory. Never forget the power of our God. Number 2, He's absolutely sovereign in that He knows the end from the beginning. He does as He pleases in heaven and in the earth. This should encourage us as believers. Whatever comes into our life is being filtered to us through the hands of a loving God, not to break us, but to shape us, to mold us, to conform us to His image. Number 3, God gives us prophecy to let us know what is coming and to embolden and encourage us that God is on the throne and He has our back. Daniel is getting all this prophecy about this madman so that the nation of Israel, who truly knew their God and were reading their Bible, would know that it was coming. They would be emboldened and they would be encouraged when it happened, knowing that God is fulfilling his word and God would take care of them. God would walk them through the persecution. We talked about verse 32, the people that know their God shall stand firm and take action. Knowledge of the true and living God will not compromise, and it will take action. We've seen this over and over again in the book of Daniel. The question would be, where did Daniel and his three friends get the moxie to tell Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire, no, and at multiple occasions? And I would argue they got the moxie because they knew God and they would not compromise. Point number 5. Compromising our faith and beliefs is the first step in walking away from God, and it brings tragic consequences. What I'm going to read you comes from 1 Maccabees chapter 1. I'm going to just read verses 10 through 15. I want you to hear this message. What they thought is when Antiochus was forcing Hellenistic principles and policies, they would just go along to get along. But going along resulted in them sinning against God and bringing God's judgment upon them. Had they resisted Antiochus IV, the movie would have played out much different. They would have stood boldly for their God. But because they compromised to get along, destruction. So 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 10 through 15. From them came forth a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus the king. He had been a hostage in Rome. He began to reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days, lawless men came forth from Israel and misled many. These are Jews misleading many Jews, saying, quote, "Let us go up and make a covenant with the Gentiles round about us. For since we've separated from them, many evils have come upon us." They said, listen, the reason we're having problems is because we're not going along with the Greeks. Let's go along with the Gentiles and things will be better. Verse 12, this proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king. He authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, according to the Gentile custom. So in front of the temple, they built a gymnasium, and they began to compete in the gymnasium in the nude. That was the Gentile custom. They removed the marks of circumcision. They abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. Close quote. Compromise always has as the end place, if you do not repent, destruction and disaster. Number 6, last week we said spiritual warfare is real. And you and I are in a battle, and part of that battle is not compromising. Part of that battle is being in the Word. Part of that battle is praying. Part of our spiritual warfare is walking with God in the details of our life. Number 7, we do not need to understand every prophecy to walk by faith, to be pleasing to God. We're going to read this next week, but I don't want to bury the lead. The angelic being is going to dump more on Daniel. In Daniel chapter 8, here's what Daniel says. I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? Now, we would all agree that Daniel serves as a beautiful picture of Christ. But Daniel also serves as a beautiful picture of a believer living his life by faith, living his entire life, his young years, his middle years, and his elderly years, walking by faith. A man who is running the race that is set before him. Here is one of the premier believers in the Bible. He sinned, of course, but we see a man who walked with God and he did not understand everything and it was delivered directly to him. We should be worried when somebody does understand everything. Number 8, I'm sorry. Jesus is the sovereign one who puts an end to the rule and reign of every anti-Christian force he encounters sooner or later. Just like Antiochus IV would be put down with no effort, just like Hitler was ultimately put down, all Antichrist will be or have been put down, and even the final Antichrist that we'll read about next week, Lord willing, will be put down with no effort at all. Never forget, the Antichrist may rage and he may appear to be violent and unstoppable. Jesus stops him with just his breath. I present to you the first 35 verses of Daniel chapter 11. Lord willing, we'll pick back up here next. We got Easter this Sunday. So the Sunday after Easter, we'll pick back up and wrap up, Lord willing, the book of Daniel as we launch off in our next study, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. God bless you until we meet again in class or here on YouTube.